Hey, folks. Just one comment quickly on David's presentation before I get into mine. I love to talk about culture. That's not what my presentation is about. But gosh, who knew it was important for me to be empathetic? I'm like a guy. I'm in this male-dominated tech culture. It's kind of funny that for most of my career, what was most important was for me to be a really deep expert in some particular technology. That was the best way for me to have a good job and protect my job and everything else. And, this idea that it's important for us to learn new things and learn about other people and deal with other people is a part of what's making this kind of movement more successful and a part of how we're able to do bigger things. And so it's really important. I love it that the DevOps world is this very tech inspired. It's kind of grown up grassroots, but it's worrying about things that, as Matt was saying, sounds hippy-dippy in some ways, but it's about other human beings. And it's really important. So I thought that was great. So my presentation is a little bit more about where software's going, and it's kind of some strategies on how to do it better. And it'll fit kind of in that context. And let me kind of quickly go a little bit into who I am. I've had a long career in software development. I've had a chance to see software done really well in a lot of cases, and wow, have I ever seen it done badly in all kinds of different ways. And so I try to use that experience as much as I can. And I've been really lucky to work with some really great people and some influential people that's been really helpful to me. Like I said, 30 years in software development. I came out of the small talk community. You'll see a lot of the people that got Agile going originally came from that community. The style of development that you see with Agile, code and test, do little things, incrementally build what you're doing, that's as old as any other style of development. Waterfall doesn't predate that. It's just that it was only used in certain communities for a while. It was only used in sort of the research community. And what we found over time is that it really makes more sense for almost all kinds of software. Because in almost every kind of software, you're needing to experiment, try new things. And so I had a great advantage of I had a chance to work with people like Kent Beck and Dick Gabriel and Adele Goldberg, people from that kind of community, and learn about that style of development before Agile was even coined. And then in the Agile world, I've had a great chance to work with people like Craig Larman, Ken Rubin, Dean Leffingwell as well, as far as the people that have started to build up Agile and make it a bigger and bigger thing. And then more recently, I was continued to be lucky and had a chance to, I worked at ThoughtWorks for a while. I got to work directly with Jez Humble as he was publishing the book of Continuous Delivery, and worked with a lot of the early customers doing continuous delivery. And a lot of what this talk is about how to get to continuous delivery, what it really takes to do that. I work now for I've kind of got the best of both worlds for me, because I've spent a lot of my career consulting with big organizations, which is good. There's lots of problems to fix and everything to deal with there. But they're not always the most pleasant places to be. Where you really want to be, I find, is in a startup. And so I've got that now. I'm in a startup, and I'm still consulting with big organizations and getting a chance to go around and do things like this. So lucky me, that's all I can say. So here's what I would like to talk about today. It's sort of combining a couple of things that I think are of keen interest out there in the software world that may not feel related, but I think they really kind of are. One is, there's quite a bit of agreement now that generally Agile is a good thing. Many, if not most organizations have either already done it long ago and forgotten even to call it that, or they're in the process of doing Agile kinds of things. And the big question, though, is that you go in and look at is, well, how do we do this bigger? Because Agile feels like it's just made for being in a startup. It feels like it's just made for small teams only. I've got 150 developers. I've got a big system. How do I go about doing this at a bigger scale? And as I'll talk about, there's not wide agreement yet on really how to do that. A lot of people are doing it, but exactly how there's a lot of argument about it, and I'll talk about some of that. The other thing I want to talk about is how DevOps is evolving. And I think this is a really healthy thing, too. We're starting to talk about different things in DevOps than we started out in talking about DevOps. And I think the healthy part of that is that I think that while we haven't necessarily solved all the problems, we kind of have a good strategy for how to solve some parts of the problems, and now we're moving on. We're moving on to the things that are maybe a little bit more difficult, which these cultural and organizational things are the ones that really take a lot of time. And I guess my point is that in both the case of scaling, what we want in software is we need to do more, and we need to do it faster, and we need to do it with better quality. Okay, we need to figure out how to do all those things. And if we're going to do all those things, the point that I'll make is that we need to find the right places and the right ways to collaborate and communicate with each other, and we need to figure out how to make good decisions. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. So the thing we're trying to avoid is this situation. I think it's great to go in and learn new things. I see a lot of organizations, in some cases, going to DevOps. They're like, okay, development organization, you're now in charge of ops. And that feels like this. That's a little bit scary in a lot of cases. And there's this fine line between I want to learn new things, so I don't necessarily know. You don't always want to put the person in a role that's done the same thing a bunch of times before. I mean, a lot of people think that's it makes good sense, but actually that's a good way to just bore people to death and burn them out, is to have them do the same thing over and over again. You want people that are challenged and we're learning new things. At the same point, you don't want them to be just sort of completely lost. So let's talk about kind of my first topic in there, which is scaling Agile development. And people talk a lot about how do we do this? How does it make sense to scale what we're doing? And sometimes what kind of gets lost is the first, sort of the first recommendation, which is don't. Pretty much all of our problems in software, not all, but most, relate to introducing too many new things at once. Okay? Continuous delivery and a lot of DevOps is about that too. It's about let's introduce less new stuff at a time. If you're doing a large software project, you have multiple teams all doing new software that all has to come to fruition at the same time. That's very risky. You'd be much better off, instead of having 10 Scrum teams, you'd be much better off having one Scrum team do all the work and just take the time and do it in a serial fashion. And I could argue that in most cases, you would get it done just as fast. Because the extra complexity of 10 teams having to collaborate with each other is a huge amount of overhead and creates a huge amount of quality risk and everything else. And so you should look really closely at, can you break up what you're doing into small pieces and just take smaller teams and get the work done as you need to. So that's the first recommendation. Of course, everybody says, okay, fine. Now I got 150 developers, how do I scale Agile? I still have this issue. So that's the other interesting thing about, in the overall Agile community. As I mentioned earlier, there's not a great amount of agreement of exactly on how to, for instance, scale Scrum. There's several people out there that have sort of come up with methodologies. Probably the leading one these days is Dean Leffingwell's Scaled Agile Framework. There's another, Craig Larman's LESS, Large-Scale Scrum. The Scrum founders have done another kind of an approach. IBM pushes another approach. In most cases, what they're all doing is they're mapping kind of Agile forms to existing enterprise structures. They're saying, well, we got an architecture group, so we need to figure out how the architecture group is going to play with all these Scrum teams. And the other thing that they're usually about is they're about how do all the Scrum teams communicate with each other. So you see all these Scrum of Scrum things. And even though most of the people behind this say, Scrum of Scrum shouldn't be just a status meeting going kind of up the line. I find more often than not that's pretty much what it turns into, is status meetings so that higher up somewhere can make decisions. And that's not really Agile. What's really Agile is teams that are empowered, that are making decisions for themselves. And so I think all of these different frameworks, I mean, you can try them, they can work, but the thing that I find missing is, when someone asks me about, okay, how do I scale? My question is, okay, I have multiple teams, they're working on software, their software has to interoperate, it has to work together. I started my career doing DoD, very large systems, and a lot of avionics systems in a lot of cases, where you had different boxes that had to communicate with each other. Today, it's all software instead of all the hardware in a lot of cases. And so for me, it's like, okay, here's two teams, they're working in parallel. At some point, they have software that depends on each other. How are you going to demonstrate that they've done that work? That's kind of the thing that I look at. And so that's sort of the approach that I look at. And here's the kind of high level of kind of how I think about it. And I call this kind of an integration points plan. And it's something that I recommend to every organization that's trying to do a large project. And basically, you think of it as, here's different teams, they're doing work in some sort of a stream of work. They're taking, stories and turning them into code. And what you've got to do is come up with a plan of demonstrations. And when I say demonstrations, I don't mean dog and pony shows. I mean demonstrating working software. And so what I'm showing here is that the first demonstration is Team 1 and Team 2 have some code that needs to work together. And what needs to happen is people from Team 1 and people from Team 2 need to start working together, based on a particular date, and say, we need to do a demo at this date. Here's what we're going to show. You kind of have to create a little subgroup, and they need to work towards getting that demo done so that you can do that. And then a little bit later, you've got a separate set of teams that have a different demo that they have to show of their work kind of interoperating together. And you just kind of go down the mix. And a full release of whatever your project is when all the teams have code that needs to interoperate in some way that you need to demonstrate. But in a lot of cases, you won't need all the teams involved. You'll need just some of them. So there's this plan and this constant sort of almost parallel plan of where are all the places that we need to have integrated things working together. And I think that is that's what Scrum of Scrum type meetings should be talking about. They shouldn't be talking about what's my status, so somebody somewhere else can feel good. If the executive needs to know how the project's going, they need to come down to where the teams are working and look at what's happening there. That's their way of getting status. This is a way for teams to think about, okay, we have other teams depending on us. This is the point where we need to show, what we've done to support the other teams that are out there. And so moving down. So let's move on to the kind of next topic here, which is, all right, how is DevOps changing? I mentioned to some of the other people that since I've been here, I was out at the DevOps Enterprise Summit conference in San Francisco. I guess it was week before last. I was really impressed. It was more of an executive level conference. It's kind of it's been pointed out to me it's not purely Gene Kim's conference, but Gene Kim is a very strong presence and kind of helps curate what's going on there. And what I thought was interesting about it is the point of the conference was to show, that DevOps isn't just for West Coast hipsters anymore. It's kind of for all kinds of different organizations are having real success with it. And some of the companies that presented there, like Target, which talked about being kind of a demoralized IT organization that's kind of rejuvenated themselves by using DevOps and doing a better job. That was really inspiring to me. They talked about DevOps for mainframes, for ZOS. They talked about DevOps in government, DevOps in all kinds of different places. It was really interesting. But I think that one of the points that I saw, at my company, we have one of these really good old line ops guys. He's actually a friend of Gene Kim's, knows the DevOps community really well, but he's like one of those people that historically was just like worth their weight in gold, and he is, because he's such a good kind of ops guy. And it's kind of funny because he's of that kind of era, which was sort of like, hey, give me your apps and I'll run them. I'll be responsible for them. And the point that I always make for him is he may be able to do that, but guys or girls like that are really hard to find. And most organizations don't have them. And it's not really that reasonable anymore to think in terms of ops truly being able to fully support a lot of applications. That's one of the reasons why DevOps makes sense, is that you need the developers in order to really support a lot of what's going on. Anyway, what this guy made a comment to me about the conference. He said, well, this is becoming a continuous delivery conference. And he said it as more of a complaint because he was more interested in all the more ops and monitoring oriented technology, which is cool stuff. But I viewed it as a really positive thing, because what it said to me was that the initial focus of the DevOps world has been on build and deploy and operations types of technologies, and those are great. There's awesome stuff out there. I'm a super fan of Chef and Ansible and Puppet and a lot of the other things that are out there you think of in terms of the DevOps world. At the same time, we kind of know how to do that now. There's great examples of how to get that stuff done, and I think the DevOps world is kind of moving on to some of the next problems. And the much harder problem, I've gone to a few organizations now, and they've said, oh yeah, we're DevOps. We have fully automated our build and deploy to production mechanism. And I'll ask, well, how often do you do that? And they're like, oh yeah, once a quarter. Wow, they really saved a lot by automating that thing that they do once a quarter. Okay, what you really need to do is, where the automation is important is when you do it 10 times a day. Or when you do it every week, or you do it every day. Something like that is what we're really looking for, but that's harder. It takes a lot more to get to the place where you can do that, and it's more of the sorts of things that continuous delivery deals with. So for me, DevOps world getting more merged with what continuous delivery about, I see it as a good thing. Nothing against the great kind of automation and ops technology that's out there. I think it's awesome. We're in this more difficult phase now of figuring out how to do the automation. That's a little bit of what I want to talk about here. The state of tests and test environments out there is still pretty bad in most of the industry, most of what you look at. Part of my sort of message to a lot of people is test is really strategic. This old attitude of test. So look, can somebody else, that's QA's job, that's somebody else to go and take care of a lot of that. That just really doesn't fly anymore. You can't do it. It's too strategic as far as how you get tests done. The other issue that I see a lot is that nobody, the test environments, whose responsibility is it? Is it QA? Is it IT? And nobody really wants to deal with that and getting all of that stuff set up. And once again, it's strategic. You can't get your software done if you can't efficiently test and you don't have good tests. So one of the DevOps initiatives that I oftentimes recommend for people is, how are you dealing with your environments? How are you, do you have them? Are they right? Can you do what you need to do within them? And do you have the right kinds of tests to run within them? That's an area where my company provides some technology, but it's only sort of the place where these things need to happen. It's the actual environment. The actual tests, every company has to build their own and do their own things. So, I think that we've got to start thinking of test as being more strategic than we've been thinking so far. So this is where kind of delivery pipelines come in. Which is a concept that's brought up in the continuous delivery book, which is, the other point to make here, I talked a little bit earlier that maybe not everybody's, comfortable with continuous delivery, how it works or what it's about. And the simplest way for me to explain it and talk about it is, the Agile world basically came up with this idea or has been talking about this idea of delivering more often. And initially it was, let's deliver software maybe on a monthly basis or something like that, whereas before it'd been once a quarter or what have you. And then we got down to where sprints were typically down to 2 weeks. We're trying to deliver software every 2 weeks. But a big team or multiple teams, that's still a lot of code that can happen every 2 weeks. One way to think about continuous delivery that I like is that instead of, a lot of people thought that sprints were going to go to 1 week instead of 2 weeks. Actually, what I've found is that what happens, especially with continuous delivery, is every change is a release. You're basically making releases so frictionless that every change can be a release. And the feedback, the comment I get back from that is, oh, okay, you just want to patch all the time, which a lot of companies are doing. They're patching all the time. And I'm like, well, not really, because in most places, the patches that I see mean we've just changed production and we're going to test it in production on the fly. We're just going to take the risk is what a patch ends up really being. And that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about every change, no matter how small it is, being a release, and you deciding what does a release mean? And how easy can I make that and how fast can I make that? So that's what you're trying to do. So a delivery pipeline is the steps it takes to release a piece of software, and you're going to have multiple delivery pipelines going at once. I think I may have lifted this graphic from Chef, so thanks to the Chef folks that are here. I think that's where it came from. I'm not sure, but it's just sort of a thing that shows the different pipelines happening at once. And this is the thing that happens with continuous delivery. Each of these are different releases. You end up having essentially multiple releases in play at one time, and each step along this path is what I would say it's a decision you've got to make. At each step in this pipeline, test. In this case, we're calling the pipeline test, UAT, load, stage, production. At each one of those points, there's two things that are important. One is you need a way to run that test. You need a place to run that test and a way to run that test. The second thing is that you're answering a question. You're saying, is this software ready to move forward, or do we need to go back and do more work? And so two things jump out at me. There's this proliferation of environments, and that you need lots and lots of environments in order for the teams to work independently. Too often, I see organizations fan out and do a bunch of work in parallel, and then they have to all get back in line in front of the one test lab that's available, that's being constantly brought up and down and reconfigured and everything else. So having lots of environments is helpful, but then the other thing is, what are these tests? And I think that's the other thing that a lot of organizations get wrong. They've maybe had some problems in production, and so they layer on tons and tons of tests, and they want to be testing, they want to run huge regressions before they take any step, and that slows everything down too much. You want this to move quickly, so what you really need is the exact test necessary at each step along this line to say, we're ready to move forward, we're not ready to move forward. That's sort of the core of the idea. You think about, what are the different parts of the delivery pipeline, just in thinking in terms of, and what's sort of the tool landscape, and this is just a fraction of the tools that are out there, but, and this is just talking about building and getting any sort of software in at all. And you just talk about, how do we capture our ideas? Nowadays, oftentimes those are in epics, stories, tasks, and what you're trying to get out of it is a plan or a roadmap of what you're doing for your next release, what's coming down the pike. Then you've got our editors and IDEs to get our code in. We've got our various, version control out there to help us with tracking our changes, which a big part of continuous delivery is to make sure that everything you do is versioned. It's not just the code, it's every script, it's every build template, it's your infrastructure, it's everything gets versioned. And then there's actually the build process and the CI process where things like Jenkins and TeamCity and so on can be involved in kind of orchestrating a lot of what's going on here. And then you've got provisioning. I think of the point of provisioning is I need a testable system. So you use a Puppet, a Chef, an Ansible, maybe a Vagrant to help you get to a place where you've got something that's fully populated and ready to test. And then test is trying to get you to a tested system. So you run that, and now you've got it tested. And then finally, to deploy, you're looking at a working system, and that's where you go to VMware or cloud or bare metal, what have you. So this is just sort of some of the basics in here. So, what do DevOps and CD mean for the organization kind of generally? This old line idea that the way to stay stable is to hold off change, that's culturally a thing you've really got to battle and fight, because the reality is that just won't work anymore. There's too many things that need to be introduced. And the reality is that the whole goal is, you want to turn that idea on its head. It's like the best way to stay stable is to change all the time. But the changes need to be very, very small. That's the whole key. Smaller changes happening more frequently. I think that the point of that is that very small code changes taken all the way to production, when there's the old problem of integration, the old problem of test is, oh my God, which thing broke us? Which change is the problem? Okay? If you get the changes small enough, when you have a problem, when your tests aren't good enough and you need something new, it's usually pretty obvious where the problem is. So that's the advantage of small changes, is they're usually easy to fix. We were talking about this earlier in the week. It's like, how important is rollback? Well, you need rollback. You need to have that capability. But in my experience, most organizations don't roll back. They fix it. They roll forward, and when they have a problem, they fix it. They add something new to the test suite that tests for that problem so they don't have it again. So small changes and the ability to do something about the problems are kind of the key. I've talked a little bit already about this ability this need for environments is important. And the other thing that's important about the environments is you need to be able to create them and throw them away when you're done. Drift in production and in your test environments is a big problem, and the easiest way to deal with it is to constantly build new environments from scratch so that you know how they're built, you know what's in there. So, when I talk to people about putting this together and how do you get the various pieces into place, one of the, a lot of the organizations that I talk to, they're like, oh my God, okay, we really want to do continuous delivery, which by the way, I'm amazed at the amount of agreement there is out there in the community that continuous delivery is the future, when only really a small percentage of organizations can realistically probably get there very soon. But just about everybody agrees that journey makes good sense. That is the future of software. We're not going to have releases in the future. It's just the question is, how quickly can we get there? And for some organizations, it's going to take quite some time. It's because they've got a lot of automation type work to do. And the classic mistake that I see is a lot of organizations will say, okay, I need automated tests. I'm doing a bunch of manual stuff now. This is bad. I'm going to start scrounging around everywhere I can and find any code that I can possibly put into an automation suite. That way I can run that as part of my continuous delivery pipeline. And what I find when organizations do this is that basically they just added a bunch of really crappy code to their production to their overall environment that now they have to maintain, because they've just kind of grabbed any sorts of tests that they could automate and put them in there. I think that once again I'll go back to the statement: tests are strategic, and the issue is exactly at each point along the line in continuous delivery, at each point in the pipeline, what test will tell me whether I'm safe to have my software move forward or whether I need to do more work. That's what you need to sit down and design. And so I find it's a lot more efficient to go in and design new, fast tests, and don't think in terms of testing everything at every stage. Think in terms of the sum of all your tests in your pipeline give you as much coverage or whatever metric you want to use that you're confident about the thing going into production. And manual test and full regression suites, I see it over and over again. Some organizations got completely burned on quality in production, and now they've put this new edict: we will fully regress after every change. Well, they just slowed themselves down to a crawl. And what that means is they're just not a confident place, and have slowed themselves down. So regression's great. Do regression all the time. Do manual testing all the time. It simply shouldn't be a part of the critical path of getting code into production. Use a set of automated tests that you've carefully designed to get you into production, and constantly be looking for problems that need fixing on their own as another QA activity as well. I think that's a kind of maybe a smarter way to go about what you're doing here. I always think about the collaboration that went on with the people behind this sign. It was sort of like, what if instant death is not enough? We need something extra, to really motivate them. And so, okay, the $200 fine, that hits them where they live, That's right. There you go. So. So, some of the things that I've said already before, collaboration around test, it's a strategic thing. Getting these tests designed and getting them to work in a way that where you're confident and improving them over time is one of the most important activities in an IT organization. And so this is something that has really got to be thought about, and the right people need to be put on, and the right things need to be built. These tests need a place, either a physical or a virtual lab. I think that physical labs probably aren't going to be around all that much longer unless they're absolutely needed, because they just don't scale appropriately. Virtual labs, cloud-oriented ones that can be created and destroyed are where the future is in that area. And then collaboration that happens here, in those integration kinds of setups that I talked about before, where two teams are working on, they need their own little virtual lab to test their software working together. They need a place to collaborate there. So this is a place where you also want video. You want an easy way for these two teams, which may not be co-located, to be able to figure out how stuff is working together to get things done. So that's important. And then there's always this sort of same pattern. We're always deciding, are we done? Are we ready to move forward, or do we need to go back and do some more work? I think that's the key kind of at every point. So that's what I've got. Thanks very much.